My husband locked me in the basement, declared me dead, and stole my pension. He thought a hurricane would be my tombstone, washing away his crime along with the wreckage of our home. But I survived. And when I escaped, I made sure that the next home he lived in was a cold, unforgiving prison cell. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Celia Washington, and for a long time I was a ghost. This is the story of my resurrection and my revenge. Retirement was supposed to be a gentle, quiet sunset. For 35 years as a history teacher at a high school in New Orleans, my life had been governed by the ringing of bells and the turning of pages. Now at 66, the only bell was the gentle chime of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the only pages were the ones in the novels I finally had time to read. My life was finally my own, a reward for decades of hard work. Or so I thought. My husband, Roland Devereaux, had retired years ago. Or rather, he had stopped working. Roland was a man of immense charm, a handsome, silver-tongued man who could talk his way into any room and out of any responsibility. He'd had a series of ventures over the years: real estate, consulting, import-export, all of which had fizzled out, leaving behind nothing but a trail of debt that my steady teacher's salary had quietly erased. For the last decade, he hadn't worked at all, preferring to live a life of leisure as a consultant, a life funded entirely by my pension contributions and careful savings. I never minded. I loved him. His charm had swept me off my feet when I was a young woman, and in many ways it still did. He handled all our finances, a task I was happy to relinquish. He would pat my hand and say, "You just worry about molding young minds, my love. Let me handle the messy world of numbers." And I, a woman who found more comfort in the Peloponnesian War than in a 401k statement, had trusted him completely. Our home in the Garden District was my sanctuary, a beautiful old house with a wide porch and a garden full of jasmine and hydrangeas. It was a testament to my life's work. But there was one feature of the house that Roland was particularly proud of: the basement. It wasn't the damp, dingy cellar common in old New Orleans homes. It was a reinforced storm cellar, a concrete bunker he had insisted on building out years ago. "For the hurricanes, Celia," he'd said with a dramatic flourish. "A fortress to keep my queen safe." It had a heavy steel door with a formidable deadbolt, and its own ventilation system. It was our gilded cage, our safe room. A few weeks into my retirement, Roland came to me with an idea. "Darling," he said, his voice smooth as bourbon, "now that you're retired, it's the perfect time for us to finally get organized. Let's go through those old boxes in the storm cellar. Your mother's heirlooms, my old business papers. It's a task for a quiet afternoon." I agreed. My chronic illness, a form of lupus that had been managed for years, sometimes left me with a deep fatigue, but that day I was feeling strong. The thought of sorting through our history, of touching the objects that had defined our life together, felt like a fitting way to begin this new chapter. He led me down the steep wooden stairs into the cool, dry air of the cellar. It was just as I remembered. Neat shelves lining the concrete walls, stacked with boxes, a small cot in the corner for emergencies, and a few cases of bottled water and canned goods, always kept ready for hurricane season. "You start with that box of your mother's china," he said, pointing to a dusty crate. "I'll just run up and get us some iced tea." I smiled and turned to the box, my mind already drifting back to my mother's kitchen, the feel of the delicate hand-painted plates. I heard Roland's footsteps ascending the stairs. I heard the heavy steel door swing shut. And then I heard the sound that would become the dividing line of my life. The before and the after. It was the sharp, metallic, and utterly final sound of the heavy deadbolt sliding into place. I froze, my hand hovering over the dusty box. Must have been an accident. The wind, perhaps. "Roland," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the concrete room. Did the door just lock? Silence. A cold tendril of fear began to creep up my spine. "Roland," I called again, louder this time. "Can you hear me? The door is locked." I walked to the bottom of the stairs and looked up at the solid steel door. I could see no light around its edges. It was sealed. I reached for the doorknob on my side. It turned uselessly in my hand. There was no way to open it from the inside. That was the point. It was a storm cellar designed to keep the dangers of the outside world from getting in. It had never occurred to me that it could also be used to keep someone from getting out. I banged my fist on the cold steel, the sound a dull, unsatisfying thud. Roland, this isn't funny. Open the door. I listened, my ear pressed against the metal. I could hear nothing but the frantic pounding of my own heart. He was gone. The iced tea was a lie. The trip down memory lane was a lie. His charm, his love, his entire life with me. It had all been a lie, a long, elaborate con leading to this single, final, metallic click. I was a prisoner. I was 66 years old, a retired teacher with a chronic illness, and my husband, the man I had loved and trusted for 40 years, had just locked me in a concrete box and walked away. The gilded cage had become a tomb. The first few hours were a blur of frantic, useless activity. I screamed until my throat was raw. I beat my fists against the unyielding steel door until my knuckles were bruised and bleeding. I searched every corner of the concrete box for another way out, a crack, a weakness, but there was none. The cellar was exactly as Roland had designed it. A fortress. A tomb. As the adrenaline faded, it was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. This was not an accident. This was not a cruel joke. This was a plan. The neat stacks of canned goods, beans, soup, tuna, and the cases of bottled water were not just for a hurricane. They were provisions. He had left me enough to survive. For a while. He didn't want me to die quickly. He wanted me to fade away, to disappear from the world while he remained in it. My initial confusion and fear began to curdle into a new, unfamiliar emotion. A white-hot, incandescent rage. How could he do this? The man I had shared my life with, the man whose debts I had paid, whose ego I had soothed, whose life of leisure I had funded with my own hard work. The sheer, sociopathic audacity of it was almost impossible to comprehend. Days bled into one another, marked only by the faint, cyclical hum of the ventilation system. I ate the cold beans from the can, drank the bottled water, and slept on the dusty cot. My world had shrunk to the size of this concrete box, to the damp chill that seeped into my bones, to the darkness that was broken only by a single bare light bulb. And above me I could hear him. The cellar was not completely soundproof. The plumbing and ventilation pipes acted as a crude conductor of the life that was continuing without me, just a few feet above my head. I would press my ear to the cold copper pipes and listen. I heard his footsteps, his cheerful whistling. I heard the television, the sound of music. He was living his life, a happy, carefree life, directly on top of my grave. The most torturous sounds were the phone calls. I could only hear his side of the conversation, his voice a muffled, distorted rumble through the pipes. But I could piece it together. And what I pieced together was the story of my own death. I know, it was so sudden, I heard him say one afternoon, his voice thick with a fake theatrical grief. The lupus, it took her in her sleep. She didn't suffer. That's the only comfort I have. He was telling people I was dead. I heard him talking to my friends, to our neighbors, accepting their condolences with a practiced, sorrowful tone. The man was a performer, and this was his greatest role. The grieving widower. The most painful call was the one I knew was to my best friend, Lorraine Jackson. Lorraine was a retired NOPD detective, a woman as sharp and cynical as I was soft and trusting. She had never liked Roland. "He's too smooth, Celia," she'd always said. "Like a snake in a silk suit." I strained to hear his words to her, my heart pounding. "Lorraine, my dear," he said, his voice a perfect imitation of a broken man. "I know you two were so close. I can't believe she's gone. Yes, of course, the memorial will be next week. I just need some time." I could imagine Lorraine on the other end, her detective's mind searching for cracks in his story. But what reason would she have to doubt him? My illness was real. Sudden death was plausible. Roland's performance, I was sure, was flawless. Weeks went by. I lost track of time. My body grew weaker, my lupus flaring up from the stress and the damp, but my mind grew sharper, harder. The rage was a fire in my gut, the only thing keeping me warm in the cold, concrete darkness. I began to understand the full scope of his plan. It wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was about the money. My pension. My life insurance. I heard him on the phone with a man he called his lawyer. They were talking about documents, about certificates, about claims. He had forged my death certificate. It had to be. He was a con artist, and this was his masterpiece. He was creating a paper death for me, a legal fiction that would unlock the entirety of my life savings. He was cashing in on me. The life insurance policy I had diligently paid into for 30 years. the teacher's pension that was supposed to be my reward for a lifetime of service. It was all his now. He had not only buried me alive, but he was now robbing my grave. One night I heard something new through the pipes. Laughter. A woman's laughter. It was light, musical, and utterly carefree. And it was in my house. He had brought a woman into our home, into our bed, while I was trapped in the darkness beneath their feet. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound, it was almost surreal. He was celebrating his new life, his new wealth, his new woman directly on top of the tomb he had built for me. The darkness in the cellar was absolute, but it was nothing compared to the darkness that was growing in my own heart. I stopped screaming. I stopped beating on the door. I conserved my energy. I ate my rations. I focused on one thing and one thing only: survival. I would not die in this concrete box. I would not let him win. I would get out. And when I did, the grieving widower was going to find out that his wife's ghost had come back to haunt him. And this ghost wanted more than just justice. It wanted revenge. Time in the basement became a shapeless, gray thing. I measured it in the number of cans I had emptied, in the slow, agonizing ache of my joints, in the rhythm of Roland's life above me. I learned his new schedule. He slept late. He had his lady friend over most evenings. He spent his afternoons on the phone talking about investments, about travel, about the new car he had bought with my money. My money. The thought was a constant, burning coal in the pit of my stomach. My health was failing. The damp cold of the cellar aggravated my lupus, and a deep, rattling cough settled in my chest. Some days the fatigue was so profound I could barely move from the cot. But my will to live was a stubborn, unkillable thing. It was no longer just about survival. It was about retribution. I would lie on that dusty cot in the dark and I would plan. I would imagine the look on his face when he saw me again. I would imagine the sound of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. These fantasies were my medicine, the only thing that kept the despair at bay. I had been in the cellar for what I guessed was 3 months when the air began to change. The low, constant hum of the ventilation system seemed to struggle, and the air that came through the vents felt heavy, thick with a wet, electric energy. And then I heard a new sound from the world outside. A low, distant moan. The wind. Over the next 24 hours, the sound grew from a moan to a howl, and then to a full-throated, terrifying roar. I had lived in New Orleans my entire life. I knew the sound of a hurricane. This was a big one. Above me, I could hear Roland in a state of frantic activity. I heard him dragging furniture away from the windows, the sound of a hammer as he boarded up the glass. He was preparing the house to weather the storm. But he had made a critical, arrogant miscalculation. He had forgotten about me. He had no reason to come down to the storm cellar, the one place in the house that was truly safe. He believed he was alone. The storm hit with a fury I had never experienced before. The concrete walls of the cellar vibrated with the force of the wind. I could hear things breaking upstairs, the shatter of glass, the splintering of wood. The roar was constant, a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the very air from my lungs. And then came the water. I heard it first as a gurgle in the pipes, then as a slow, steady drip from the ceiling. Within an hour it was a stream. The storm surge. The levees must have broken. The city was flooding. My prison was about to become a watery grave. The water rose quickly, first covering my ankles, then my knees. It was cold, filthy, and it rose with a terrifying, relentless speed. I climbed onto the cot, the highest point in the room, and watched the water level creep up its metal legs. This was it. After everything I had endured, after all my vows of revenge, I was going to die here, drowned in the dark like a rat in a cage. I thought of Lorraine. I thought of my students. I thought of the life I had lived, the sun on my face, the smell of jasmine in my garden. And I wept, not in fear but in a deep, profound rage at the injustice of it all. The house above me was dying. I could hear its death groans, the shriek of twisting metal, the deep, wrenching crack of ancient timbers giving way. There was a sudden, deafening crash from directly overhead, and the single bare light bulb that had been my only companion flickered and went out, plunging me into absolute, terrifying darkness. I was sitting on the cot, the cold water now swirling around my thighs, when I heard a new sound. It was a sharp, cracking noise, followed by a groan of stressed metal. It came from the direction of the stairs. I held my breath, straining to hear over the roar of the storm. There was another crash, a sound of splintering wood and screeching metal, and then a sudden violent rush of water poured down the stairwell. and with it came a sliver of gray, stormy light. The door. The storm, in its indiscriminate fury, was tearing my house apart. The structural collapse, the sheer force of the wind and water, had done what my fists never could. It was breaking down the door. I slid off the cot into the chest-deep water and fought my way towards the stairs, my weakened body screaming in protest. I reached the base of the stairs and looked up. The steel door was mangled, twisted on its hinges, bent inward by the force of whatever had crashed into it from the other side. It was open. Just a few inches, but it was open. With a surge of adrenaline, I pulled at the twisted metal. It groaned, but it moved. I pulled again, my muscles screaming, my lungs burning. The gap widened. It was just enough. I squeezed my thin, frail body through the opening, the jagged metal tearing at my clothes, and tumbled out into the churning, debris-filled water of my own hallway. I was free. I fought my way through the wreckage of my home, a place that was now just a skeleton of broken walls and floating furniture. I made it to a shattered window and pulled myself through, out into the apocalyptic landscape of my neighborhood. The world was a churning, gray sea of destruction. But it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I was out. I was alive. And my storm of freedom was just beginning. The world outside my tomb was a nightmare landscape. The beautiful tree-lined streets of my New Orleans neighborhood were gone, replaced by a churning brown river filled with the wreckage of 100 lives. Houses were tilted on their foundations, cars were submerged, and the air was filled with the shriek of the wind and the smell of gas and ruin. I was a ghost. Gaunt, shivering, dressed in rags, I clung to the roof of a submerged car, my body numb with cold and exhaustion. The months in the cellar had wasted me away, and the fight to escape had taken the last of my strength. I don't know how long I was out there, drifting in and out of consciousness. All I knew was that I had survived my prison and I would not die in this flood. It was a National Guard patrol moving through the flooded streets in a high-water vehicle that found me. They pulled my frail body from the water, wrapped me in a coarse, gray blanket, and took me to a makeshift shelter that had been set up in a local school gymnasium. The shelter was a scene of organized chaos. Hundreds of people, their faces etched with shock and loss, were huddled on cots. The air was thick with the smell of wet clothes and disinfectant. I was just one of many, a nameless, storyless survivor. A doctor checked me over, tut-tutting at my emaciated state and the deep, rattling cough in my chest. They gave me dry clothes, a cup of hot, sweet coffee, and a cot in a crowded corner. For the first time in months I was safe. I was warm. And I was surrounded by people. But I had never felt more alone. I had a story to tell, a monstrous, unbelievable story, but who would I tell? Who would believe the ghost of the Ninth Ward? There was only one person. It took me a full day to get access to a working phone. When I finally did, my fingers, still numb and clumsy, trembled as I dialed the number I knew by heart. It rang once. Twice. Lorraine Jackson. Her voice, a familiar no-nonsense bark, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Lorraine, I whispered, my voice a raw, broken croak. It's me. There was a long, profound silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing. Who is this? She finally asked, her voice sharp with suspicion, but with an undercurrent of something else. A fragile, impossible hope. It's Celia, I said, tears streaming down my face. Lorraine, it's me. I'm alive. I heard a sharp, choked gasp. Celia? My God, Celia, is that really you? But you're dead. We had a memorial. Roland. Roland is a liar, I said, my voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. He's a monster. He locked me in the basement, Lorraine. He left me to die. I told her everything, the words tumbling out of me in a frantic, disjointed rush. The lock clicking shut, the months in the dark, the forged death certificate, the hurricane, the escape. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. And I knew with every fiber of my being that she believed me. When I was done, her voice was a low, dangerous growl, the voice of the NOPD detective she had been for 30 years. Where are you? She asked, her tone all business now. Don't move. Don't talk to anyone else. I'm coming to get you. She was there in an hour, parting the crowds in the shelter like a force of nature. When she saw me, her strong, stoic face crumpled. She wrapped her arms around my frail body and held me. And for the first time since my ordeal began, I felt the solid, unshakable ground of a love I could trust. Her own home in a higher part of the city had been spared the worst of the flooding. She took me there to a clean, quiet guest room, and for the first time in months I slept in a real bed between clean sheets. When I awoke, the detective was back. She had set up a command center in her living room. There were maps, notepads, and a laptop open on the coffee table. The look on her face was one I had seen many times over the years when she was on a case. It was the look of a hunter on a fresh trail. "Okay, Celia," she said, handing me a cup of hot, nourishing broth. "Tell me again. Everything. Every detail you can remember. Every sound you heard. Every word he said on the phone. We're going to get this son of a bitch. And I'm not talking about putting him in a city jail. I'm talking about putting him in Angola for the rest of his miserable life." For the next few days, as my body slowly began to heal, we worked. I was the star witness and she was the lead investigator. I recounted every muffled conversation, every clue I had gathered from my tomb. She took meticulous notes, her mind piecing together the timeline of Roland's crime. She made a few calls to her old contacts at the NOPD, quiet, off-the-books inquiries. She didn't tell them the whole story, just that she was looking into some financial irregularities regarding the estate of her recently deceased friend, Celia Washington. The pieces started to come together with sickening speed. The death certificate was a forgery, and a clumsy one at that, signed by a doctor who didn't exist. The life insurance policy, a major one, had been paid out in full to the sole beneficiary, Roland Devereaux, just a week after my death. My teacher's pension had been cashed out, the entire lump sum transferred to a new account in Roland's name. And then came the final damning piece of the puzzle. Roland, the grieving widower, had not been in New Orleans when the hurricane hit. Bank records showed that he had emptied all the accounts and had boarded a one-way flight to Miami 2 days before the storm made landfall. He had thought the hurricane would be the perfect cover. He thought it would destroy the house, destroy my body, destroy any evidence of his crime. He thought he had committed the perfect murder. He had left a ghost in his wake, but he had no idea that his ghost had a retired NOPD detective for a best friend. The hunt was on. While my body healed, my mind, fueled by Lorraine's relentless pursuit of justice, grew stronger every day. The frail, terrified woman who had been pulled from the floodwaters was gone, replaced by a woman with a singular, burning purpose. Every bowl of soup Lorraine made me, every hour of uninterrupted sleep in a safe, warm bed, was fuel for the fire of my resolve. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. And I was a key witness in the hunt for the man who had tried to erase me. Lorraine was a master at her craft. It was like watching an artist at work. She transformed her quiet, comfortable living room into an incident room, the walls slowly being covered with notes, timelines, and financial charts. She was retired, but the detective in her had been resurrected, more fierce and determined than ever before. This wasn't just a case for her. It was personal. This was for her best friend. "He's arrogant, Celia," she said one afternoon, pacing in front of a map of Florida she had pinned to the wall. "That's his weakness. He thinks he's smarter than everyone else. He thinks he got away with it. And that means he's going to be sloppy." She used her old contacts not as official police resources, but as friends she could call for a favor. A buddy in the cybercrimes unit helped her trace the IP address from which Roland had last accessed his new bank accounts. A former partner who now worked as a private investigator helped her pull property records in Miami-Dade County. The trail he had left was a breadcrumb path of his own vanity. He hadn't hidden the money in offshore accounts or complex trusts. He had started spending it immediately and lavishly. He had bought a new top-of-the-line sports car, paying for it in cash. He had purchased a wardrobe of expensive, flashy clothes. And he had rented a penthouse apartment in a glittering high-rise in South Beach, a place with panoramic views of the ocean and a price tag that was obscene. "He's not hiding, Celia," Lorraine said, a grim smile on her face as she looked at the rental agreement on her computer screen. "He's bragging. He's living the life he always believed he was entitled to, the life he stole from you." The picture of his new life was a daily torment and a daily motivation. While I was fighting to regain my strength, learning to walk again without my legs trembling from weakness, he was likely sipping cocktails by a rooftop pool. While I was having nightmares of the dark, damp cellar, he was sleeping in a king-sized bed with 1,000 thread-count sheets. Lorraine was meticulous. She didn't just find him. She built an ironclad, inescapable case against him. She got a copy of the forged death certificate and had a friend in the forensics lab confirm it was a fake. She got the sworn affidavits from the life insurance company and the teacher's pension board, detailing the claims he had filed as my grieving widower. She compiled the bank records showing the massive influx of cash into his accounts, followed by the immediate extravagant spending. She had everything: motive, means, opportunity, and a clear, damning paper trail. And she had the one piece of evidence that no lawyer could ever refute: me, the living, breathing victim of his attempted murder. As my physical strength returned, so did my spirit. The quiet, trusting schoolteacher was gone forever, buried in that cellar. In her place was a woman of cold, hard resolve. I started eating not just for sustenance but to build my strength for the confrontation to come. I started walking every day, first around Lorraine's house, then around the block, pushing through the pain and the fatigue, my eyes fixed on the final goal. We had to be careful. We couldn't go to the New Orleans police officially, not yet. Roland was a charming man with connections. We couldn't risk him being tipped off, giving him a chance to run again. Lorraine's plan was to deliver the entire perfect case to the authorities in Miami, to catch him completely by surprise in his new luxurious life. "We're not just going to have him arrested, Celia," she said, her eyes gleaming with a cold, righteous fire. "We're going to have him humiliated. We're going to walk into his palace and watch them drag him out in handcuffs. And you are going to be there to see it." The thought was terrifying, but it was also electrifying. The idea of facing him again, not as his weak, trusting wife, but as his accuser, his downfall, was the most powerful medicine I could have imagined. After 2 months of meticulous work, the case was ready. Lorraine had a thick binder filled with every piece of evidence, every affidavit, every bank statement. It was a complete and total indictment of Roland Devereaux. The hunter's trail had led us directly to his door. Now it was time to close the trap. The flight to Miami was the first time I had been on a plane in over a decade. As the aircraft lifted off from the tarmac in New Orleans, I looked down at my city, a place of scars and resilience, a place that had been both my home and my prison. I was leaving the ghost of myself behind. The woman who was flying to Florida was not the same one who had been pulled from the floodwaters. This woman was not a victim. She was a witness. And she was on her way to deliver the final bill. Lorraine had coordinated everything with a detective she knew in the Miami-Dade Police Department, a man she had worked with on a joint task force years ago. She had sent him the entire case file. He was, as she had predicted, shocked, appalled, and more than happy to assist in the takedown of a man like Roland. We met the detective and his team in a quiet briefing room at a local precinct. They treated me with a gentle, profound respect, looking at me as if I were a creature from a myth, a woman who had literally come back from the dead. The plan was simple. Roland was known to host lavish parties at his penthouse. He was having one that very night. They would wait until the party was in full swing, then they would make their move. As we drove towards the glittering high-rises of South Beach, my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Was I ready for this? Could I face the man who had left me to die in the dark? I looked at my reflection in the car window. I was still thin, my face still gaunt, but my eyes were clear and steady. The fear was there, but the resolve was stronger. The penthouse was on the top floor of a sleek, modern building that looked like a shard of glass piercing the night sky. The lobby was all marble and chrome, a world away from my quiet, comfortable life. We rode up in a service elevator with the plainclothes detectives, the silence thick with anticipation. When we reached the penthouse floor, we could hear the party before we even saw it. The thumping bass of music, the clink of glasses, the sound of loud, carefree laughter. Roland's laughter. The sound was a physical blow, a chilling reminder of the life he had been living while I was fighting for my own. The detectives positioned themselves. And then they breached the door. The scene inside was one of opulent chaos. Dozens of beautifully dressed people, all chrome and silk and champagne. And in the center of it all, holding court like a king, was Roland. He was dressed in a white linen suit, a glass of champagne in his hand, a beautiful young woman on his arm. He looked handsome, powerful, and utterly untouchable. And then he saw me. I stood in the doorway, flanked by Lorraine and the detectives. The music screeched to a halt as the party guests turned to see what the commotion was. Roland's face, which had been animated with laughter, froze. The color drained from his cheeks. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. He stared at me, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost. his own personal ghost come back to haunt him. Celia, he whispered, the name a strangled, impossible sound. Hello, Roland, I said, and my voice was not the weak, trembling voice of his victim. It was the strong, clear voice of his judge. Did you miss me? The detectives moved in then, their movements swift and professional. They cuffed him, the sound of the metal clicking shut, a beautiful final music. He didn't resist. He was too stunned, too broken by the impossible sight of me, alive and standing before him. As they led him away through the stunned, silent crowd of his new wealthy friends, his eyes never left mine. They were filled with a mixture of terror, disbelief, and for the first time, a dawning, horrifying understanding of his own complete and total ruin. The final act took place in a courtroom months later. I stood before the judge and delivered my victim impact statement. I told the court everything. I spoke of the darkness, of the cold, of the fear. I spoke of the hurricane, of my escape, of my fight to survive. And I spoke of the betrayal of a 40-year love that had been nothing but a lie. I looked at Roland, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his charm gone, his arrogance shattered, and I made sure he heard every word. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. The judge called his crimes an act of monstrous, almost unimaginable cruelty. I walked out of that courtroom and into the bright Miami sunshine with Lorraine by my side. My revenge was complete. It wasn't a fiery, violent act. It was a quiet, relentless pursuit of the truth. I had survived his tomb. I had weathered his storm. And I had made sure, with every ounce of strength I had left, that his new luxurious home was a cold, unforgiving, and very, very permanent prison cell. My name was Celia Washington, and I was at long last free.